The Kansas plains stretched endlessly under a sky the color of old pewter, where November wind cut through a man's bones like a dull knife seeking marrow. Thomas Hartwell pulled his coat tighter as he guided his horse along the rutted trail that connected his ranch to the distant town of Cedar Falls, a journey he made twice a month for supplies, and one he'd been making alone for the better part of 20 years. At 73, Thomas had grown accustomed to solitude the way some men grew accustomed to whiskey, as both comfort and burden, something that eased certain pains while creating others. His ranch sat isolated in a fold of prairie land where buffalo grass bent before the eternal wind, and the nearest neighbor lived 15 miles east. It was country that either broke men or made them harder than the stones that dotted the landscape, and Thomas had survived long enough to become something in between. The cold was particularly bitter today, the kind that made horses blow clouds of vapor with every breath and turned the water, his canteen, to slush despite the leather wrapping. Thomas hunched deeper into his saddle, calculating the distance to town and wondering if he should have waited another day for the weather to break. But supplies were running low, and winter on the Kansas plains didn't negotiate with a man's convenience. He was perhaps 3 miles from Cedar Falls when he saw her, a small figure beside the road, motionless as the fence post that marked abandoned homesteads. At first, Thomas thought it might be a marker stone or a piece of debris blown by the wind, but as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his weather heart contract with recognition. A young girl, maybe 14 or 15, sitting in the sparse grass with her arms wrapped around her knees. She was Native American, Cheyenne, by the look of her clothing and the way she wore her hair in 2 long braids that hung over her shoulders like dark water. Her dress was simple but well-made, decorated with beadwork that caught what little light filtered through the gray clouds, but it was thin cloth meant for warmer seasons. She had no coat, no blanket, nothing but her own arms to shield her from the wind that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. Thomas reined in his horse 20 feet away, studying the girl with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the prairie held both wonders and dangers in equal measure. She didn't look up at his approach, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just sat with her face turned toward the ground as if she were listening to something only she could hear. "Miss," Thomas called out, his voice roughened by years of talking mainly to horses and cattle. "You hurt?" The girl raised her head then, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her face. She was beautiful in the way of carved stone, high cheekbones and dark eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom, but it was the expression she wore that caught his attention. Not fear, exactly, though there was wariness there. Not desperation, though he could see she was suffering from the cold. Instead, there was a kind of resigned dignity, as if she had made peace with whatever circumstances had brought her to this desolate stretch of road. She said nothing in response to his question, just watched him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Thomas couldn't tell if she understood English, or if she simply chose not to respond to a stranger who might represent any number of threats. He'd heard enough stories about what happened to native girls who found themselves alone and vulnerable in white man's territory to understand her caution. The wind picked up, sending a particularly vicious gust across the open plain that made Thomas's horse sidestep nervously. The girl shivered, a brief, involuntary movement that she tried to hide by pulling her arms tighter around herself. But Thomas saw it, and something in that small display of vulnerability cut through 2 decades of carefully maintained isolation. Without thinking, without weighing consequences or considering complications, Thomas dismounted from his horse and walked toward the girl. She tensed as he approached, her body coiling like a spring ready to bolt. But she didn't run. Instead, she watched him with the alertness of a wild animal calculating distance and danger. Thomas stopped just outside arm's reach and slowly untied the thick wool blanket that had been rolled behind his saddle. The same blanket that had kept him warm through countless cold nights, that had been his companion on hunting trips and cattle drives, that Elena had given him as a wedding gift 47 years ago. It was well worn but still serviceable, heavy enough to turn aside the worst of the Kansas wind. "Here," he said quietly, holding out the blanket. "You need this more than I do." The girl stared at the offered blanket as if it were something miraculous, something that couldn't possibly be real. Her eyes moved from the wool to Thomas's face, searching for some sign of trickery or hidden cost, some indication that this kindness came with strings attached. Finding none, She slowly reached out and accepted the blanket with hands that shook from more than just cold. Thomas watched as she wrapped the wool around her shoulders, saw the way her entire body seemed to relax as warmth began to penetrate the chill that had settled into her bones. She looked up at him then, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked enough to show the gratitude beneath. "Thank you," she said in clear English, her voice soft but steady. Thomas nodded, already turning back toward his horse. "You get yourself somewhere warm," he said over his shoulder. "Roads are no place for anyone in weather like this." He remounted and continued toward town without looking back, already forgetting the encounter in his focus on reaching Cedar Falls before the weather turned worse. It had been a simple thing, giving away a blanket, the kind of basic human decency that shouldn't require thought or recognition. In a few hours, he'd buy another blanket in town, probably one not nearly as good as the one Elena had made, but adequate for his needs. As Thomas disappeared into the gathering dusk, he had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had been witnessed by eyes hidden in the tall grass, or that news of what he'd done was already racing across the prairie faster than any horse could carry it. He couldn't know that in the traditions of the girl's people, accepting a blanket from a stranger created bonds that transcended the boundaries between cultures, or that by morning, those bonds would be honored in ways that would change his solitary life forever. The trading post in Cedar Falls buzzed with the usual mix of frontier commerce and gossip when Thomas pushed through the heavy wooden door, stamping snow from his boots. The warmth hit him like a physical thing after the brutal ride from his ranch, and he stood for a moment letting sensation return to his hands before approaching the counter where Jake Morrison tallied accounts in his careful script. "Tom," Jake nodded, looking up from his ledger, "didn't expect to see you in weather like this. Temperatures dropped 20 degrees since noon. Needed supplies," Thomas replied, pulling his list from his coat pocket. "Coffee, flour, beans. And I'll need a blanket. Good wool if you've got it." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. "Blanket? Thought you had that fine one Elena made you. Blue wool with the fancy edge work." "Gave away," Thomas said simply, studying the shelves lined with goods. "Gave away?" Jake's voice carried the incredulity of a man who understood that in frontier country, a good blanket could mean the difference between life and death. "To who?" Thomas hesitated, suddenly aware that his explanation might sound foolish to a practical man like Morrison. "Young girl on the road. Native. Half frozen." The trading post went quiet. Thomas became aware that the three other customers, farmers from the settlements east of town, had stopped their own conversations to listen. In the silence, he could hear the wind rattling the windows and the tick of the old clock Morrison's wife had insisted on importing from St. Louis. "You gave your blanket to an Indian girl?" asked Pete Wilson, one of the farmers, his tone suggesting Thomas had confessed to feeding wolves from his dinner table. "She was cold," Thomas said, meeting Wilson's stare directly. "Figured that mattered more than anything else." "Tom," Jake said carefully, "you know there's been trouble lately. Raiding parties hitting settlements south of here. Army's got patrols out looking for hostiles. Girl wasn't hostile. She was just cold." Wilson snorted. "They're all peaceful until they're not. You probably just armed them with information about your place, your routines. Mark my words, Tom, you'll regret that soft heart." Thomas paid for his supplies without further comment, loading them into his saddlebags while the other men continued their speculation about his judgment and the supposed threats lurking on the prairie. He lived on the Kansas plains long enough to know that fear often masqueraded as wisdom, and that men who lived safe in town often had the strongest opinions about dangers they'd never faced. The ride back to his ranch took longer than usual, partly because of the worsening weather and partly because Thomas found his mind wandering to the girl he'd encountered. He wondered where she'd been going, whether she'd found shelter, whether his blanket had been enough to keep her safe through what was shaping up to be a brutal night. There had been something in her eyes, not just gratitude, but a kind of recognition, as if his simple gesture had meant more than he understood. By the time Thomas reached his ranch, full darkness had fallen, and the wind was carrying the promise of serious snow. He cared for his horse with the methodical attention of someone who understood that in isolated country, the life of your mount could be your own life, then made his way to the small cabin that had been home for 23 years. The cabin felt particularly empty that night. Thomas prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, ate it standing at the kitchen window while watching snow begin to fall in earnest. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, but tonight it pressed against him with unusual weight. Maybe it was the approaching storm, or maybe it was a memory of dark eyes that looked at him with something approaching wonder when he offered a blanket, without asking for anything in return. Miles away, in a sheltered valley where the Cheyenne had made their winter camp, the girl Thomas had helped sat in the lodge of Chief Standing Bear, still wrapped in the blue wool blanket that smelled of sage and honest work. Around her, the tribal council listened as she recounted her encounter with the white rancher, her words carrying the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered when dealing with matters of honor. "He asked nothing," she said in the Cheyenne tongue, her voice soft but clear in the warm circle of firelight. "No payment, no debt, no promise of future favor. He saw need and answered it without question or expectation." Standing Bear, whose weathered face had seen 70 winters and whose judgment had kept his people alive through the worst years of conflict with the white soldiers, listened with the attention such matters deserved. In the old days, before the reservations and the broken treaties, such gestures had meaning that transcended the boundaries between peoples. A gift freely given, especially to the vulnerable, created obligations that honor demanded be acknowledged. "White Dove," the chief said, using the girl's given name, "you are certain of his intent. He sought nothing from you." "Nothing, grandfather," White Dove replied. "He gave from kindness, not calculation." The council murmured among themselves, discussing the implications in voices too low for outsiders to hear. These were men who had fought the white soldiers, who had seen their hunting grounds divided and their people confined, who had learned to distrust the promises and gestures of whites. But they were also men who understood honor, who knew that occasionally, rarely, individual actions could transcend the hatred between races. "The old laws did not distinguish between white and red when speaking of honor debts," said Gray Wolf, the war chief whose scars told stories of battles fought when the world was different. "A gift to one in need, given without expectation, creates bonds that must be acknowledged." Standing Bear nodded slowly, his decision already made but not yet spoken. "Prepare the riders," he said finally. "At dawn, we honor old debts in the old way." As snow continued to fall across the Kansas plains, transforming the harsh landscape into something soft and dreamlike, two worlds that had learned to regard each other with suspicion prepared to meet in a way that neither Thomas Hartwell nor the citizens of Cedar Falls could have imagined. By morning, a simple act of human kindness would bear fruit that would echo across generations, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures cast the longest shadows. Thomas woke before sunrise, as had been his habit for 50 years, to find the world transformed by snow. Through his bedroom window, the Kansas plains stretched white and unmarked to the horizon, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional wind-bent tree. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a kind of crystalline silence that only comes after heavy snowfall. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn cold, built up a fire in his kitchen stove, and put coffee on a brew while he planned his day. The cattle would need hay scattered in the near pastures, and he'd have to break ice on the water troughs, routine winter work made more urgent by the fresh snow. Thomas was reaching for his coat when he heard it, the sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats, not the scattered rhythm of a single rider, but the deep, rolling thunder of many horses moving together across frozen ground. Thomas paused, his hand on the door latch, listening as the sound grew closer. In 23 years of isolated living, he'd never heard anything like it, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to shake the very foundations of his small cabin. He opened the door and stepped onto his porch, coffee cup forgotten in his hand, as he stared at what approached across his snow-covered land. Warriors, hundreds of them, mounted on horses whose breaths steamed in the frigid air, riding in perfect formation across the white expanse of his ranch. They came from the north, their approach deliberate and unhurried, and as they drew closer, Thomas could see the individual details that made the sight even more extraordinary. These were not the ragged remnants of a defeated people that most white settlers imagined when they thought of Plains Indians. These were warriors in full regalia, war paint bright against copper skin. eagle feathers dancing in their hair, weapons polished and ready. Their horses were magnificent animals, clearly bred for both speed and endurance, and they moved with the fluid unity of men who had trained together for warfare since childhood. At their head rode a figure that commanded immediate respect, an older man whose bearing spoke of natural authority, whose face showed the kind of wisdom that came from leading people through impossible times. Chief Standing Bear, though Thomas didn't yet know his name, wore his leadership like a cloak, visible in every line of his posture as he guided his people across the frozen landscape. The warriors numbered in the hundreds. Thomas would later learn there were exactly 700, and they arranged themselves in a great semicircle around his cabin and outbuildings, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air, but otherwise maintaining perfect discipline. They faced the small homestead in complete silence, their presence both magnificent and terrifying in ways Thomas struggled to comprehend. For a long moment, no one moved. Thomas stood on his porch, acutely aware of his own vulnerability. One old man facing an army, but strangely unafraid. There was something in the quality of their stillness that suggested ceremony rather than threat, ritual rather than raid. They had not come with war cries or weapons raised, but with a kind of formal dignity that spoke of purposes beyond his understanding. Then movement caught his eye at the center of the formation, and Thomas felt his breath catch as he recognized a slight figure riding beside the chief. The girl from yesterday, still wrapped in his blue wool blanket, her dark hair gleaming in the early morning light. She looked directly at him across the distance, and even at 50 yards, Thomas could see the gravity in her expression. Chief Standing Bear urged his horse forward, approaching Thomas's porch with the careful dignity of a man conducting important business. He stopped 20 feet away and dismounted, his movements fluid despite his obvious age. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the silent air, and though he used English, his accent gave the familiar words a different rhythm, a different weight. Thomas Hartwell, the chief said, and Thomas startled to hear his own name spoken with such certainty. Yesterday, you gave aid to one of our people. You asked nothing in return. You showed honor. Thomas found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. I gave a cold girl a blanket. Seemed like the right thing to do. Standing Bear nodded slowly, as if this response confirmed something he had hoped to hear. In the old ways, before the white man's laws divided the earth with lines and papers, such gifts created bonds between peoples. A kindness freely given must be acknowledged, must be honored. The chief gestured toward the girl, who urged her horse forward until she too was close enough for easy conversation. White Dove is the daughter of my heart, granddaughter of my blood. When you covered her shoulders with your blanket, you showed her the respect due to any human being in need. This is not common between our peoples. Thomas looked at White Dove, seeing her now not as a random stranger in distress, but as someone whose identity carried weight among her people. I didn't know who she was, he said honestly. Wouldn't have mattered if I had. That, Standing Bear said with something that might have been approval, is why we have come. The chief turned slightly, addressing his warriors in the Cheyenne language. Though Thomas couldn't understand the words, he could hear the formal cadence of ritual speech, the kind of pronouncement that marked important moments in the life of a people. The warriors responded with a sound like controlled thunder, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, acknowledging whatever had been declared. We have traveled to the night to honor an old debt, Standing Bear explained, switching back to English. You have shown that not all white men have forgotten what it means to be human. For this, you have earned something that cannot be bought or taken by force, the respect of the Cheyenne nation. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settling around him like the snow that covered his land. Transformative, beautiful, and profound in ways he was only beginning to understand. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say nothing, Standing Bear replied. Words are not needed for what passes between us now. But know this. From this day forward, you are known to our people as a man of honor. Your safety is our responsibility. Your welfare our concern. The bonds created by kindness are stronger than iron, more lasting than stone. As the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that rose from the snow-covered prairie, Chief Standing Bear made a gesture that brought forward a group of younger warriors, leading a string of horses. Thomas watched in growing amazement as the finest animals he'd ever seen were arranged before his cabin. horses that move like flowing water, their coats gleaming with health and careful grooming. Among our people, Standing Bear explained, honor demands that gift be answered with gifts. You gave freely from your need. We give freely from our abundance. Thomas stared at the horses, understanding that he was looking at wealth beyond his ability to calculate. These were not the common stock horses that ranchers use for everyday work, but animals bred for generations for specific qualities: speed, endurance, intelligence, and the indefinable spirit that made a good horse into a great one. In the economics of the frontier, such animals represented not just transportation but status, capability, and survival itself. "I can't accept this," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion he struggled to control. "What I did, it wasn't worthy of such repayment." White Dove spoke for the first time since the formal proceedings had begun, her clear voice carrying easily in the crisp air. "In our traditions, the value of a gift is measured not by its cost, but by the spirit in which it is given. You gave from kindness to a stranger. These horses are given from gratitude to friend." Standing Bear nodded approvingly at his granddaughter's words. "The girl speaks wisdom passed down through generations. These animals carry in their blood the history of our people. Horses descended from those that carried our warriors across the great buffalo grounds, that bore our families to safety when the soldiers came, that remember in their bones what it means to run free across unlimited spaces." Thomas looked from the magnificent animals to the faces of the warriors who had traveled through a winter night to honor his simple gesture. He saw in their expressions not the savage hostility that fear and prejudice had taught him to expect, but the same basic humanity that had motivated his own actions the day before, the recognition that kindness deserved acknowledgement, that honor created obligations that transcended the artificial boundaries between peoples. "There's something else," Standing Bear continued, his tone becoming more formal, more ceremonial. "White Dove has requested permission to speak privately with you. She carries words that are hers alone to give." The chief stepped back, and White Dove dismounted with the fluid grace Thomas had noticed the day before. She approached his porch with measured steps, still wrapped in his blue wool blanket, her dark eyes holding depths of meaning he couldn't yet fathom. "May I speak?" she asked, her English more careful now, weighted with the importance of what she had to say. "Of course," Thomas replied, stepping down from his porch to meet her on level ground. White Dove looked back toward the assembled warriors, then returned her attention to Thomas. "Yesterday, when you gave me your blanket, you saved more than my comfort. You saved my life. I had been walking for 2 days, seeking help for our people. The cold would have taken me before I reached town." Thomas felt something shift in his understanding of the previous day's encounter. "What kind of help?" "Food," White Dove said simply. "Medicine for the children who are sick. The Indian agent has not brought the supplies promised by the government. Our people face hunger, and winter has just begun." The reality of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow. While he had been congratulating himself on a simple act of kindness, she had been on a desperate mission to save her people from starvation. His blanket hadn't just provided comfort. It had enabled her to complete a journey that meant survival for others. "The help you were seeking," Thomas said slowly. "Did you find it?" White Dove's expression grew more complex, shadowed by understanding of the world's harsh realities. The men in town were not interested in hearing about hungry Indian children. They spoke instead of raids and threats, of dangers that exist more in their fears than the world beyond their walls. Thomas felt shame burn in his chest, not for his own actions, but for the attitudes of his fellow whites that had turned a young woman's plea for help into an exercise in futility. "What will you do now?" "We will survive," White Dove said with quiet dignity. "We always survive. But your kindness has given us something more precious than food or medicine. It has given us hope that not all white hearts have turned to stone." Standing Bear's voice called out in Cheyenne, and White Dove turned to respond. The exchange was brief, but Thomas could hear the formal tones of ceremony being concluded. "My grandfather says it is time for us to return to our people," White Dove translated. "But before we go, I have something that belongs to you." She began to unwrap the blue wool blanket from her shoulders, but Thomas stopped her with a gesture. "Keep it," he said firmly. "If it helped you yesterday, it might help you again." White Dove smiled then, the first truly unguarded expression Thomas had seen from her. "You give gifts as easily as breathing," she said. "No, one of the spirits led me to your path." As the warriors began to form up for departure, Chief Standing Bear approached Thomas one final time. "You have shown us that honor still lives in some white hearts," he said. "This will be remembered in our stories, told to our children's children. The name Thomas Hartwell will be spoken with respect around Cheyenne fires for generations to come." Thomas watched as 700 warriors mounted and formed their column, moving with the same perfect discipline they had shown upon arrival. As they rode away across his snow-covered ranch, the sound of their horses' hoofs gradually fading into the vast silence of the Kansas plains, Thomas felt a profound loneliness that had been his companion for 20 years finally begin to lift. He was no longer just an isolated old rancher waiting for death in an empty cabin. He had become part of something larger, a story that would outlive him, a bridge between two worlds that had learned to see each other as enemies. And all because he had given a blanket to a cold girl on a winter road. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that painted the Kansas plains in shades of emerald and gold, Thomas Hartwell sat on his porch with a letter in his weathered hands. The first personal correspondence he'd received in over 3 years. The envelope bore the official seal of the territorial governor, and its contents had taken him by surprise in ways that still left him shaking his head in wonder. The letter was an invitation to serve as a liaison between the territorial government and the Cheyenne Nation, a position that would involve helping negotiate fair distribution of government supplies and mediating disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. It was work that would take him away from his isolated ranch, work that would require him to navigate the complex politics of two cultures that barely understood each other. But it was work that mattered, and Thomas had discovered over the winter months that matching was something his soul had been hungry for without his even knowing it. The horses that Chief Standing Bear had given him grazed peacefully in his near pasture, their magnificent forms a daily reminder of that extraordinary morning when 700 warriors had honored a simple act of kindness. Thomas had learned to ride them, had discovered that they possessed not just physical superiority, but an almost supernatural understanding of their rider's intentions. They were, he understood now, more than gifts. They were teachers, showing him daily what it meant to move through the world with dignity and purpose. Word of the encounter had spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers and traders who delighted in telling the story of the old rancher who had earned the respect of an entire tribe through a single gesture of human decency. Some told it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of showing kindness to hostiles. Others understood it as proof that the barriers between cultures were not as insurmountable as fear and prejudice made them seem. Thomas had received visitors throughout the winter. Government officials wanted to understand how he'd managed to establish peaceful contact with the Cheyenne, settlers seeking his advice about dealing with native peoples, and journalists eager to record his story for Eastern newspapers hungry for tales from the frontier. To all of them, he gave the same answer: treat people like human beings, and they'll generally respond in kind. It seemed simple enough to be meaningless, but Thomas had learned that the simplest truths were often the most difficult to practice. A movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention, and Thomas looked up to see a familiar figure approaching across the prairie. White Dove rode one of her people's magnificent horses, but she traveled alone this time, without the formal escort that had marked their first encounter. She wore a simple doeskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long hair flew loose in the spring wind like a banner of freedom. "Thomas Hartwell," she called as she drew near, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine friendship. "I bring greetings from my grandfather and news from our people." Thomas rose to meet her, noting how the months had changed her. The wary vigilance that had marked her during that first winter encounter had been replaced by confidence and purpose. She moved with the assurance of someone who had found her place in the world and intended to make the most of it. "White Dove," Thomas replied, using the English version of her name as she had taught him. "It's good to see you. How are your people faring?" "Better," she said, dismounting with fluid grace. "The new Indian agent is a fair man who keeps his promises. The children are healthy, the elders are warm, and there is enough food for all. But that is not why I've come." She reached into her saddlebags and withdrew a familiar blue wool blanket. The same one Thomas had given her on that frozen winter day that seemed like a lifetime ago. It had been cleaned and mended, its edges decorated now with beautiful beadwork that transformed it from a simple utilitarian object into something approaching art. "I return this to you," White Dove said formally, holding out the blanket with both hands. "But changed, as you changed me by giving it freely when I had need." Thomas accepted the blanket, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork that told a story in symbols he couldn't read but somehow understood. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "It tells a story of kindness repaid with kindness, of walls broken down by understanding, of two peoples learning to see past their differences to the humanity they share." White Dove's voice carried the cadence of someone who had been raised on storytelling, who understood the power of words to preserve meaning across generations. "My grandmother worked on it through the winter months, saying that some gifts deserve to be honored with the finest work of which we are capable." Thomas wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, feeling its familiar weight and the new softness that came from having been treasured and cared for by loving hands. "I'll treasure it," he said. "As we treasure the memory of the day you showed us that honor still lives in the world," White Dove replied. "But there's something else I must tell you, something my grandfather wishes you to know." She paused, her expression becoming more serious, more ceremonial. "The story of what you did has spread beyond our tribe, beyond even our nation. Other peoples have heard how one white man chose kindness over suspicion, generosity over fear. You have become, without choosing it, a symbol of what is possible when people decide to see each other as human beings rather than enemies." Thomas felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like the blanket itself. Heavy but not burdensome, significant in ways that would take time to fully understand. "The governor's letter," Thomas said, gesturing toward the official correspondence that still lay on his porch table. "The offer to serve as a liaison. That came because of what happened between us." "It came because you proved that bridges can be built between our worlds," White Dove confirmed. "And because there are others who believe, as you do, that kindness is stronger than hatred, that understanding is more powerful than fear." As they stood together on Thomas's porch, looking out over a vast expanse of prairie that had witnessed their first encounter, both understood that they had become part of something larger than their individual lives. A story was being written across the landscape of America, a story about the possibility of finding common ground between peoples who have been taught to see each other as irredeemable enemies. It had begun with a blanket given to a cold girl on a winter road. Where it would end, only time would tell. But Thomas Hartwell, who had learned that the smallest act of kindness could echo across generations, was ready to help write the next chapter. The wind that had once carried only the loneliness of isolation now carried hope across the Kansas plains. And in that hope, the future held possibilities that neither fear nor prejudice could extinguish. Sometimes, Thomas reflected as he watched White Dove ride back toward her people, the most important revolutions began not with violence or grand gestures, but with one person choosing to treat another as worthy of basic human decency. It was a lesson worth remembering, worth living, worth passing on to all who would listen, and in the growing warmth of a spring morning that promised better days ahead, Thomas Hartwell settled into his rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket that had become a bridge between worlds, and began planning for a future he had never dared to imagine.